Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for being with us. I'm Mohammed Alarian, and it's my great honor to welcome you to today's edition of Authors at Wharton. It's part of a speaker series that seeks to enrich our intellectual engagement and encourage dialogue between students, faculty, staff, and alums. It was launched 9 years ago by Adam Grant, and the idea is to run outside the classroom and engage all members of the community. Unfortunately, we haven't had one for over a year because of COVID-19. And speaking of COVID-19, I just want to wish you all well and hope that you are safe and that your families are safe. COVID is forcing us to rethink, to think differently. It's a reminder that having an open mindset is critical, including in not just how we navigate COVID, but how we come out of COVID. And it's not easy to do so. So we are delighted to have the brilliant mind of Adam Grant to help us at a time when such rethinking is not just desirable, but it's absolutely critical. You know who Adam is. He doesn't need any introduction, but I will introduce him just to torture him a little bit. I've lost count. It's either 7 or 8 years now that he has been Wharton's top-rated professor. He's a leading expert for ways to find motivation and meaning and for us all to live a more generous life. He's been validated in terms of his contribution by so many awards and recognition, including being among the 10 most influential management thinkers. At last count, he had 6 #1 New York Times bestseller. And his impact on the Penn community goes well beyond the classroom. And it actually goes well beyond Penn. He is truly the public intellectual that helps us live better lives. I know personally, I have never come across someone who has inspired me so much and who I hold in awe. I truly believe that Adam makes the world a better place. And he does so with a degree of humility and engagement that really legendary. I also want to thank Adam personally because he introduced me to the Wharton community. And I have loved being part of it. And I owe him a lot for introducing me. So his new book, which is going to be discussed today, Think Again, is another illustration of everything I've just said. He's going to be interviewed by 2 wonderful students that have already flashed when you've looked at the executive committee, Becca Beans and Violet Zhu. And they're going to be talking to him in a very engaging manner. And I hope you enjoy this. And I know that I, for one, am really looking forward to the conversation. So let me pass this to Becca and Violet.
Thank you, Mohammed. It's so wonderful to be back here at an Authors at Wharton event and streaming with you all today. As he mentioned, Violet and I are on the Authors at Wharton Student Committee and so excited to be leading this conversation today. As we're talking, please post your questions to #WhartonAuthors on Twitter for a later Q&A. And I think we're going to have a great time, so let's get right into it. Hi, Adam.
Hey, you sure know how to make an introvert who has a lot of anxiety comfortable by telling me nothing about how you're going to run the series that I usually get to host. I'm only freaking out a little bit, but I'm looking forward to this.
Awesome. So I'll tell you, we're going to start off with some questions for you from Becca and Violet, and then a quick speed round, and then some audience Q&A. How does that sound?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. So first off, what made you decide to write Think Again? How was this different than maybe Give and Take and Originals?
I think what was different about writing this book was it came out of being annoyed over and over again, right? And it started out as mild annoyance. It grew into frustration. At some point, I was morally outraged. And the experience I kept having was bringing data to people and them staying closed-minded. One of the most salient examples for me was in winter 2018. I went to a bunch of the top CEOs in Silicon Valley. I was curious about the future of hybrid work. And I said, let's run a remote Friday experiment. And we'll just test productivity, creativity, collaboration effects if people can work from anywhere 1 day a week. And they all turned me down. Never mind that we already had evidence that people could do this effectively, and as long as people were together about half the week, they would be fine. And seeing that kind of stubbornness made me wonder, why are people so bad at opening their own minds? Why am I so bad at convincing them to do it, given that this is part of my job as an organizational psychologist? And how can we build a culture where that's the norm rather than the exception? And here we are.
Thanks for giving us a behind the scenes view of the process. It's been super interesting, and it's definitely a very relevant concept right now. Another really interesting concept for me in the book was the idea of persuasive listening, a technique that's designed to make more people open to change by helping them crystallize their own views and uncover their own motivations. For many, this approach might be kind of counterintuitive, as we often think that the key to changing someone's mind is to make a better argument, not helping them explore their own view. What tips do you have for people who are interested in becoming better persuasive listeners?
Well, I think the first thing is to acknowledge at the outset of the conversation what you don't know and what you're curious to learn, right? So we have an MBA alum who was previously one of my undergrads, Jamie Whaley, who one day called me a logic bully when we were having a conversation about her decision about whether to come to Wharton or not. And I was really proud at first. And then she said, no, you're bombarding me with facts and with logic, and I don't agree, but I don't feel like I have the space to fight back. And it suddenly hit me that I've made that mistake throughout my life. That when I think somebody is wrong, I think my job is to come armed with the best evidence and try to persuade them. And I now have found myself having to explain this up front. So if I want to come in and listen to you and learn from you, Violet, I will say, you know what? I have a bad habit of being a logic bully. I've been accused of this by multiple people in different parts of my life. And so it's clearly a consistent pattern. I'm trying to not be that person anymore. If you catch me going into prosecutor mode, if you catch me hammering you with facts, please call me out, because I'm interested in learning from you here in this conversation. And I would really love for us to be open-minded. And what I found is that display of, hey, you know what? Sometimes I get stuck in my ways, or sometimes I'm too assertive. It invites the other person to hold me accountable for being more curious. It also, though, usually leads them to say, you know what? Sometimes I get really locked into my views too. And then we both commit to wanting to teach each other something or learn something. I think that's huge. I think the other thing I've learned when it comes to persuasive listening is it's helpful to know upfront what my agenda is, and either not have one, or if I do have one, put it on the table to say, you know what, I'm like when students come for career advice, for example, and I've had, legions of them be miserable in investment banking, and I want to at least, give them a little bit of a realistic preview of that. What I used to do is I just give them all the reasons why they might hate banking. And now what I'm trying to remember to do, and I don't always succeed, is to say, okay, my bias here is every year I have an army of students who comes back and says, we wish we hadn't been bankers. Please, please be more forceful with the next group so that we can spare them this agony. And so I put that on the table now and say, look, my bias is I'm worried about your sanity, and I care about your happiness and your mental health. So, you might find that some of my questions tilt in that direction, but at the end of the day, I want whatever you think is best for you, and I'm not going to judge you whatever you choose. And I think that disclaimer has been helpful for getting people to stay open.
You mentioned this prosecutor mode. Do you mind explaining to the audience the different modes of thinking that we can have?
Credit to our own Phil Tetlock for coining this framework. So Phil observed that we spend way too much time preaching, prosecuting, and politicking. When you're preaching, you're basically convinced that you're right. When you're prosecuting, you're trying to prove someone else is wrong. And when you're politicking, you're trying to win somebody's approval by campaigning and lobbying. And I worry a lot that preaching and prosecuting stop us from thinking again. Because if I've already decided that I'm right and you're wrong, then you're the one who needs to rethink, but I'm good. And politicking, I think, is a problem too, because I might tell you what you want to hear, but odds are deep down, I'm not really changing what I think internally.
And so you have these three modes, and you talk a lot in the book about an alternative, which is thinking more like scientists. So can you walk us through that a little bit more?
All right. So my favorite experiment on this is with Italian startup founders, where they go through a 3 to 4 month crash course on how to start and run a business. They all get the exact same training, knowledge, education. What they don't know is that half of them have been randomly assigned to a control group, and the other half are taught just to think like scientists. They're told your strategy is just a theory. Go do customer interviews to develop specific hypotheses about what market you might be able to succeed in. And then when you launch your first product or service, that's just an experiment to test your hypotheses. Over the next year, the founders who've just been randomly assigned to learn to think like scientists bring in an average of more than 40 times the revenue of the control group. Staggering effect. And the major mechanism is they're more than twice as likely to pivot. When they find out that their initial product was a bust or their strategy failed, instead of doubling down and escalating their commitment to a losing course of action, they say, oh, all right, my hypothesis was wrong. Let me go now and make a change. And I don't think that anybody needs to become an actual scientist to think like one, right? You don't have to go out and immediately invest in a microscope or a telescope. I just want people, as I think a good scientist is trained, to say, I'm going to value humility over pride, curiosity over conviction. I'm going to try to be clear about what I don't know and excited to discover new things.
How do you think some of the learnings from thinking like a scientist could be used to combat some of the distrust of science and vaccines in the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I tried this recently with a friend of mine who's extremely opposed to vaccines. And I swore a few years ago when he came to visit that I would never talk to him about vaccinations again. Not because I think that every vaccination should be given to every newborn, but because I think the science is pretty clear that we've saved millions of lives by protecting people against pretty preventable diseases. And I felt like I was just beating my head against a brick wall over and over again. And I got exasperated, and I was afraid that either it would damage our friendship or I just would lose respect for him. And after finishing the book and trying to practice a bunch of the principles, I said, okay, this is a test to see if I've learned anything. And there are some things I did completely ineffectively in the conversation and some things that were much more effective than anything I'd tried before. What I think worked best probably was when I said, can you help me understand what vaccines you think are more and less dangerous? And also what kinds of situations you would be completely opposed to a vaccine and when you might consider one. And all of a sudden, by asking those questions, right, about when and how and which ones, I saw all the nuances in his thinking. And I realized, you know what, he's not just staunchly anti-vax. He has a lot of specific knowledge. And so I think some of it is supported by evidence and maybe other pieces aren't. But once I see those nuances, I can actually say, all right, well, what evidence would change your mind, right? What data would you need to see? Yeah, you know what, there are risks of taking vaccines. There are also risks of not taking vaccines. And so how do you weigh those two sets of risks? And we had a much more thoughtful conversation. Interestingly, though, what got me in trouble a little bit was partway through the conversation, he said, your questions are biased. I said, what do you mean? They're not biased. I'm asking you which vaccines you like and which ones you dislike, when you would consider getting one, when you wouldn't. And he said, yeah, but all of them are tilting toward, getting me to say I would consider one. And so I feel like, you're not being neutral here. And I said, you're absolutely right. That's my bad. I'm not neutral here. I care about your children. I think you do too. I'm worried about them. I would love it if they got vaccinated. And then I said, well, this is something that happens all the time in our arguments. You're so far on one extreme that I feel like to balance things out, I have to go to the opposite extreme. And so some of the things I say, I don't even think them. Right? I'm just trying to create a representative portrait of the spectrum here. And I think, in making that mistake, I learned something, which is I do this all the time. Like the further somebody is on one extreme, the further I go to the opposite to try to highlight what's ridiculous about their argument. And that tends to make them defensive. And so I've tried to shift away from that strategy and say, look, I'm not arguing to win. I'm actually here to learn. And if I can understand your views better, maybe I can start to try to change them.
No, I love those phrases that you had, like, walk me through this. Like, can you help me understand this? Those are things that have been very helpful for me in so many professional and personal settings and having conversations. So what do you think it was? What kind of wording do you think it was that was leading him to think that you had biases in a certain way?
I mean, I don't think it helped when I said, there's this thing called science, which uses,
no, probably not.
like randomized controlled trials. And, I trust independent communities of scientists, especially the ones with tenure, to form their own expert opinions. And it's pretty hard to pull off a conspiracy when we can't even get a bunch of tenured professors to agree to throw out a forced grading curve, right? So
Nice.
I don't think that went over very well. I think the other thing that I did that it was probably a mistake was I said a couple times, I said, okay, like I was trying to exude curiosity, but my curiosity was always one directional. And so it'd be, okay, so I'm really curious. Can you help me understand what would lead you to rethink that? Or I would love to know what would shift your opinion on that. And he's like, well, why aren't you curious to know what's driving my current opinion and what would lead me to stay where I am? I'm like, okay, that's fair. You know what? Yeah, like when we study motivational interviewing, there's a difference between change talk and sustained talk. Change talk is reasons to shift. Sustained talk is reasons to maintain the status quo. And a genuinely interested interviewer would say, I'd love to understand the pros and cons here. What would lead you to stick to your current plan? What would lead you to reconsider it? And I should have been more balanced that way too. All right, I'm gonna call an audible here and say you both had to sit through my classes. Violet, you spent a week with me in person. Becca, you spent a semester with me virtually. What do you think I should rethink when it comes to what I teach or how I teach?
So the other thing that was coming, I have an echo. Is it okay? Okay.
All good.
The other thing that was coming to mind for me when you were talking just now and thinking about how you talk to your friend, how you interview him, is how much of that is sort of like putting yourself in his shoes and having some degree of like empathy and compassion. And maybe this is more just a general sort of interest of mine, is like these more like soft thing, like talking about feelings and emotions, things like that, which we got to in your class, but also sometimes it's very, data, evidence. So that'd be my take.
Yeah, I think that I would concur with a lot of that.
Wait, what's the thing I should rethink there? I just want to make sure I'm clear on this.
No, I think it would be kind of going more toward like, and maybe this is more just like my personal preference, and maybe thinking about what everybody's preferences are around data and evidence versus like stories and emotions and things like that. But I think that you overall like had a really good blend of that, in my view. And that was interesting too in the book, was that blend of evidence and stories that you mentioned, sort of the order in which you gathered those. But Violet, you should go too with what.
Very interesting. Violet?
Yeah, I think that some of these personal anecdotes that you've been bringing up here actually have a lot of the same underlying characteristics as things that we might face at school and at work. And I think that bringing in that blend of these personal stories with all of the studies that you're very apt to bring up actually makes it even more compelling for us as students.
All right, I will tell more stories of my own failures, I think is my biggest takeaway here. Done.
I guess going back to that, thinking more broadly to our organizations, how do you think that we can build cultures of learning at work?
Well, I think I've watched a lot of leaders screw this up. And one of the ways that they do is they build performance cultures that are all about excellence of execution. And over time, if you do that, you end up undermining psychological safety to admit when you don't know something. You make it harder for people to ask for help. You make it more difficult for people to acknowledge an error or say, I was wrong. And so the most effective leaders that I've worked with on this are the first ones to model that. One of our doctoral students, Konstantinos Koudaferis, who once upon a time was an MBA student in your shoes, Violet, and then decided that he wanted to come back for a PhD. He did this really interesting experiment with me where we tried to get leaders to encourage people to be open with feedback and suggestions and ideas and criticisms. And the standard way that leaders do this is they ask for feedback. They say, hey, you know what? If there's something I should rethink, if there's something we need to learn, please let me know. I'm open. And we found that temporarily created psychological safety, that people felt comfortable taking those kinds of risks. And then psychological safety evaporated because in some cases, people were not sure what was safe to speak up about. In other cases, the leader got defensive and they basically just closed the door. And in many situations, the leader just was too busy, or the feedback was seen as not high quality, or the leader didn't have control to act on it. And so people just got discouraged, and they said, look, even if I'm not afraid to speak up, this is an exercise in futility. Why bother? And what worked much better was for leaders to criticize themselves out loud, to say, all right, here's my performance review from my own boss, or here are the things that I know I'm bad at that I'm working on right now. And one of the more interesting examples we had was a leader who said, you know what, I know I talk too much in meetings. I'm constantly dominating the conversation. I'm probably like the world's worst mansplainer and manterrupter, and I'm trying to get better at that. So please, tell me if you see me doing that. And then people realize, oh, I can give that kind of feedback. And now also I know what's relevant. I know what might be in the blind spots. And I think we live in a culture where people believe that if they do that, that somehow they're signaling their ignorance or their insecurity or their incompetence. When in fact, I see that as confident humility, right? That you're secure enough in your ego to say, you know what, I have a lot of weaknesses and I'm trying to work on those.
Do you have any goals you're working on yourself?
Yeah, I have many goals. One of the ones I'm working on right now is when I get asked questions, not to just give an answer in interview mode, but actually to turn it into a conversation like this. What do you think of that goal?
I like it.
That's working great.
I really love this idea of confident humility too, that you mentioned just now. And probably one of the more surprising things for me from the book was your thoughts on imposter syndrome. I remember I first learned about this book reading Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, I don't know, in 2015 or something. And I was like, okay, my imposter syndrome, it's definitely there, but it has to go if I'm going to make my way to the top. So can you talk us through, some of these ways that it can actually be beneficial?
This is Basima Tufik, one of our former doctoral students who's now on the MIT faculty. And Basima studied how often you have imposter thoughts. So the question is, how often do you think, maybe I'm not as good as other people think I am? Maybe I'm gonna find that my capabilities aren't what everyone thinks they are, and I'm gonna embarrass myself. It turned out she studied medical professionals and investment professionals. There were no identifiable costs of having those imposter thoughts more often. And there were some benefits. Investment professionals actually made better decisions. They were more likely, when they had those doubts, to second guess their own judgments as opposed to being overconfident. Medical professionals, when they had those doubts, they were more likely to listen to their patients and maybe consider a second opinion as opposed to interrupting them with an immediate premature diagnosis. I think what imposter thoughts can do is they can motivate you to work harder because you feel like you have something to prove, right? Your confidence is below your competence and you want to close the gap. And they can also motivate you to work smarter because you realize, I'm not really sure if I know what I'm doing here, so I want to go and learn from other people. And that's not to say that this is never debilitating, right? I think if it's a syndrome, if you carry around a chronic sense that everyone's going to find out you're a fraud and you're completely incapable of doing anything, that's probably going to hold you back. But I don't think we have to make it into a syndrome, Becca. I don't think you have to overcome those doubts. We all have those doubts. And in fact, if you don't, I think that's a sign that you've become overconfident, right? That you want, I used to think that you wanted your confidence to perfectly match your competence. I now think that what confident humility is all about is maintaining a level of confidence that's a little bit below your competence, because that keeps that nagging sense of, what if I'm not good enough? And then you prepare more and you end up hopefully becoming better as a result of it.
So we talked a little bit about how confident humility applies at work, but on a more personal note, you also talked about how we should avoid overcommitting to a vision of what our path should be and where we should be going. And one technique that you brought up to help with this is to schedule these life checkups once or twice a year to reevaluate whether we're really on the right path for ourselves. What are some signs you think that we should look for during these life checkups that maybe we should consider making a larger change in our life?
I'm not sure. I think the checkup is a potentially good idea, but how to run one effectively, I don't have any data on this yet. The reason I like the idea of checkups is I've had just too many students here, right, who have gone through this experience where they take a first job in a particular industry and then they think, maybe this isn't right for me, but I've already invested a year or two and I want to move up and I'm getting paid well and I don't want to have to start over. And it's really awful then to admit to myself that I've wasted 2 years of my life. And at which point I'm like, well, it's better to admit now that you've wasted 2 than to waste the next 20. But go on, tell me more. And then what usually happens is they'll stick around in that field or that company for 5, 6, 7 years. At which point they feel like it's too late and they'd have to fall too far. Right. And then, some of them go and do MBAs and hope that's a way to pivot sideways as opposed to having to work backward. But I think what I've always hoped during that process is that just twice a year they had a reminder in their calendar to say, all right, I need a checkup. Just like you go to the doctor when nothing's wrong, right? You check in on your career and you ask yourself, is this still the job that I thought that I wanted? Have my interests and my values changed? Is this culture what I thought it was going to be? Have I reached some kind of learning plateau or for many of you, a lifestyle plateau? And does that mean it's time to consider a shift? And I think if you go through one of those checkups and you find yourself saying, you know what, this isn't what I wanted all along or what I wanted has changed, it's probably a sign that it's worth considering something new because most of the pressures are pointing in the direction of staying the course. Right? Your peer group is doing that. You probably have a lot of image and identity invested in that, right? I think a lot of people, and some of you can relate to this, have been seduced by status, right? And have said, okay, I need to work for a prestigious firm. I need to have a job title that impresses everyone else. And at some point they realize that title isn't worth a lot if it depresses me every day that I go to work. And so I guess those are the kinds of signs that I might look for.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing that I wonder about the life checkups is it doesn't sound like too often to me, like once or twice a year. Like when you put it in the context of being at a job for 5 years, then it sounds like more, but I don't know. Like one of the helpful tips I've gotten from you, Adam, is having like a weekly check-in with your significant other, especially, and kind of like checking up on all those things. So what do you think about having a life checkup like more often, a quarterly checkup or monthly checkup?
I'm definitely open to quarterly or monthly. I worry about doing it too often because I think, like anything else, you can do too little rethinking. And I think that's what most of us do, right? We do a lot of our rethinking in hindsight and say, oh, that's what regret is. Regret is a failure to rethink. And I'd like more of us to do it with foresight and say, all right, why don't I question myself before it's too late? But you can do it too often, right? You get trapped in analysis paralysis. You're second guessing your job every day to the point that you never really commit. And I don't think that's healthy either. So I guess, I don't know, like the nice thing about doing this weekly in a romantic relationship is it allows you to rethink a lot of micro things, right? So I guess Allison and I started a few years ago doing these weekly meetings, which is the most boring thing you could possibly do in a marriage. Except it's also the best thing that you could possibly do in a marriage because there's a reason you do weekly meetings at work, right? You need to do something to get in sync. You also want to save all the boring stuff and just put it all in one place so you don't have to deal with all these things that you don't care about throughout the week. And we found that the same thing was true when it came to a marriage, right? That instead of like nagging each other constantly about who's going to take out the garbage and who's going to this appointment, that we could actually say, all right, well, let's put all that stuff on our weekly meeting list. And then we only have to spend half an hour a week on it. And it was a great moment for us to say, all right, this is a checkup on what did I screw up this week? And what is it that I haven't paid enough attention to that you asked me to do during the week that I should be concentrating on now? And so I think if you're talking about rethinking at that level, sure, do it as often as you want, but have I fallen in love with the wrong person? Am I working at the wrong organization? Am I considering the wrong career path? I would not want someone to ask those questions every day.
So we've been covering some pretty heavy questions. So we're actually going to switch it up a little bit with a speed round. In the vein of rethinking opinions, we just wanted to get some of your deep-seated opinions about a few topics. This is also a good time for audience members, if you have any questions, to tweet them at #WhartonAuthors, and we'll be going to audience Q&A right after this. Adam, are you ready?
Oh, I'm ready.
All right. What's your favorite musical artist?
Musical artist? Oh, this is such a hard question for me. Sometimes I go months without listening to music and don't even realize it.
I know. That's why you have to tell us. We needed
I don't
everybody
know.
to know.
It's hard to argue with Beyonce.
Good choice.
Okay, how about your favorite fiction book?
Gone through so many iterations on this. I think favorite, I'd probably say Ender's Game.
Mm.
This one might be tough. What is your favorite ice cream flavor?
It's actually not ice cream. It's a cotton candy blizzard from Dairy Queen, which if
very
I could, I would give up all of their food and only eat that.
That sounds very good. Okay, and then last one for COVID times is your favorite Zoom reaction.
It doesn't exist yet. I think we really need a laugh track, because it just sometimes feels like telling jokes into a black hole, which discourages people from being funny, or at least attempting to be funny, which if you're not funny, I guess is a good thing. And maybe I should try to do this less often is the lesson here.
What do you talk? I love watching those videos of like friends without the laugh track. It's not uncomfortable at all.
It's so painful. Or watch some of the funniest people on earth, right? Like if you watch Trevor Noah or John Oliver with no laugh track, you're like, oh, this is a little awkward.
It's hilarious in a different way, I'd say.
It is, but I don't laugh as hard.
Okay, those are kind of some lukewarm takes overall. I don't really have anything for you to rethink on those right now, but maybe something will come up. For our audience questions, how about this first one is going to come from a faculty member named Greg. He says, how do you know if you know enough what you don't know?
That's a paradox, isn't it? I don't know if there's an answer to that. I don't know. The way that I've tried to approach this personally is when I was writing Think Again, I made an ignorance list. I just tried to come up with all the things that I didn't know enough about. And it was the list grew by the minute, right? Once I started doing it, I started out with music, and then I had financial markets, which, especially being a psychologist at Wharton, very salient to me. Like when I came here, I did not know what EBITDA was. And I kept trying to figure out what that word was. And I'm like, I'm sorry, what? Like what's an EBITDA? I don't understand. And then eventually I figured out it was an acronym, and then I had to go and look it up. So clearly not informed about financial markets. Don't know anything about chemistry, art, fashion. And then I started also coming up with a list of specific things that just puzzle me, that I don't understand. And I realized that it really bothered me that when British people sing, their accents often disappear. And I can't figure out why that is. I've talked to a bunch of linguists. Like they've tried to explain it. And, a lot of times they're like, well, the ability to sing, like it forces an American accent. I'm like, I'm not even British, but I can still sing with a faux British accent, right? So that didn't make any sense. I want to know why you can't tickle yourself, which is like, I've talked to a lot of neuroscientists on this, and the most common answer is the element of surprise, because you can't surprise yourself. And I'm like, okay, great. Like, tell someone you're going to tickle them and then do it. They still laugh. It's not surprise. There has to be more to it. And I think having these mysteries, right, these things that you just don't know, one, psychologists find that they create curiosity gaps, right? That it's almost like an itch that you want to scratch when there's a gap between what you know and what you want to know. But they also just remind you to be curious about all the things that you don't know. And so, I don't know, my personal stance is we should all have an ignorance list, and it should get longer over time, not shorter. Because every time you realize you don't know something, you dig a little bit into that area and you realize how much more you don't know and how many more interesting questions there are to explore.
Speaking of people who don't know what they're talking about, we have a question from Askuka, who's also part of our faculty. What are some red flags for identifying experts who don't know what they don't know?
Let's see, Asuka, how would I catch an expert who's overconfident? I would probably start with hearing them speak in too many certainties as opposed to conditionals. I think absolutes seem to be a sign that people are overconfident, although I could be wrong about that. But our own Phil Tetlock has found that also when studying super forecasters, that the hedgehogs who make great pundits on TV, who tell you exactly what's going to happen, are much less likely to know what they're talking about than the people who equivocate and contradict themselves and show a lot of nuance and complexity in their thinking. I have a friend who predicted the 2008 financial crisis. And he likes to boast about how he has a crystal ball and he's a better forecaster than anyone. And then the running joke from our community of researchers in this field is that he predicted 11 out of the last one crises. So he's always confident there's going to be a crisis, and eventually he's going to be right, in the same way that a lot of people are being called, pandemic Cassandras. But some of them were just fearmongers, right? Just saying there's going to be a pandemic, and if you make that prediction enough, it will probably get verified at some point. So I think having that level of certainty is a risk. I think also one of the things that I like to do is I look at who people follow on social media. And you can start to see, a little bit of tribalism or filter bubble or echo chamber on whether they only follow people who think like them or whether they follow people who disagree with them. Yeah,
we had a lot of questions around echo chambers and like social media and the role of the media in general. So would love if you could speak a little bit more to that and maybe how to get out of those echo chambers too.
I don't have a silver bullet at all. And in fact, I'm going to be asking that exact question to our next Authors at Wharton guest, John Haidt, who will be coming on the 16th. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with his work on the righteous mind and the coddling of the American mind. And I think John is as good as anyone alive at trying to figure out how we can depolarize this strange world that we're living in. I think one thing I will say that I learned that surprised me is I thought when I started writing Think Again, I was pretty convinced that that what we needed to do was show people the other side, right? That if somebody is an extreme liberal, they need to see the extreme conservative view, or at least a conservative view, and then we would help them, really complicate their thinking. And I read all this research trying to write about, how to have charged conversations in the media and on social media, and the data showed that I was completely wrong. That seeing the other side is not only not a solution, it's part of the problem. Because what it reinforces is what psychologists call binary bias, where you take this very complex spectrum of views, you oversimplify it and dumb it down into two categories that seem too black and white. And if you are an extreme liberal and somebody shows you an extreme conservative view, guess which one you're going to stick to, right? There's not a lot of motivation to be flexible there if somebody's views are diametrically opposed to yours. What seems to be much more effective is complexifying, to say any time that you see a one side versus other side or us versus them argument, your job is to ask, what's the third angle that's missing here? What's the fourth perspective that I could add? And what you're trying to do is look much more through many sides of a prism than just say, all right, issues are like two sides of a coin. And I think that has a couple effects. One, it helps people see nuances and say, all right, look, I don't necessarily agree with every single position that my ideological group happens to. And two, maybe more importantly, it also allows them to say, okay, maybe there are some aspects of this position that I haven't thought enough about or that I don't know a lot about, and I could be open to rethinking those.
So it's clearly really important to rethink our truth and to complexify these different issues. But on the other side, it takes a lot of time to be able to do that. So we had a few questions around how you should balance being an action-oriented leader and also taking the time to rethink some of our assumptions and complexify the issues that we're facing.
Okay, I had no idea how to weigh in on this question when I first started thinking about it a couple of years ago. And then I went to give a talk at Blue Origin. And I show up and I'm about to launch into my presentation and Jeff Bezos is in the audience. Mm-hmm. And there was a whole doppelganger moment where I'm like, okay, wait, I think I'm in the wrong place here. The other bald guy is supposed to be on stage. As soon as the talk was done, I wanted to ask him this exact question, because I think whether you love or hate Amazon, he's obviously made some pretty effective decisions when it comes to building his company and disrupting all of commerce as we know it. And what I took away from the conversation with Jeff was he seems to think in terms of a 2x2. And no Wharton conversation is complete without a 2x2, especially for those of you who are aspiring or recovering consultants. So the 2x2 is dimension one is how important is this decision? Is it consequential or not? Dimension two is how reversible is this decision? Can you undo it or not? And what I basically came away thinking is he is as slow as possible to make decisions if he's in the high sell. In other words, if it's highly consequential and irreversible, he will procrastinate on a decision as long as possible, wanting to get all the information, run as many experiments as he can, because afterward, if he hasn't done that homework, it's sort of too late to rethink it. It really matters, and he's stuck with his choice. And I think if you relax either of those conditions, if it's not that important or if it's easy to reverse, he's very comfortable saying, I'm going to gamble, I'll act quickly, and then I can do my rethinking later. And I thought that was a great framework, and I find myself thinking about it almost every week.
I want to go back to the question before about sort of like seeing the other side. One of the really interesting examples for me from the book was the Red Sox Yankees experiment with the different fans. And I was trying to describe it to my grandma, actually, when I was telling her I was doing this. And she stopped me and she said, no, because she's a really diehard UNC fan. And she said, no, that's just how it is. We need these rivalries. And so can you help us think more about sort of seeing other sides, like why even that's important to do?
Well, I agree we need these rivalries. I taught at UNC for a couple of years, and I learned to hate Duke with a burning passion. Yep. I already kind of hated them, but I also sort of hated UNC growing up as a Michigan fan, because some of you are old enough to remember there was a little timeout situation with Chris Webber and the Fab Five that may have cost us a championship. And no, I'm not over it at all. But I think these rivalries, they do a few things, and I wouldn't want to get rid of them. One is they motivate the teams. Gavin Kilduff has published some research showing that if you look at a team's performance in sports, you can predict how well they're going to do next season by how well their biggest rival did this season. It fires you up wanting to outperform your rival. And often it motivates you to rethink some of your plays, right? Which is a good thing. I think it's also great because it helps to strengthen our allegiance, right? We often define who we are by what we're not. And so, like, as somebody who was teaching at UNC, to say, like, I am anti-Duke, right? Like, I am not elitist. I don't subscribe to any of these principles. That helps deepen my attachment to UNC. In the same way that hating the Ohio State Buckeyes makes me more of a Wolverine. And I think those are great. I think where this goes off the rails for me is that you start to dislike people who just happen to have a different affiliation, right? So I guess the moment that really embarrassed me was, this was 2 years ago. I went to a wedding and I ran into a woman in her 70s who's a friend of a friend and works with Holocaust survivors. She is one of the most altruistic humans I've ever met, like broke my giver scale. And I just think the world of her. And we happened to be chatting about college, and she mentioned something like, oh, when I was at Ohio State, and I didn't even realize it, but I blurted out, yuck. I was disgusted at the thought of talking to someone who was a Buckeye, and then I was disgusted at myself. Like, who cares where she went to school half a century ago? How did I get programmed this way? And that's the kind of reaction I want to change, right? To say those allegiances, like, you may think they're meaningful. They're sort of accidents of birth, right? Like if you're a Yankees fan, if you'd been born in Boston, you'd probably root for the Red Sox. And so if you could play out the circumstances of your life saying, all right, if I had those experiences, would I be attached to a different team? Then that makes it a little bit easier to not hate the people who root for the other team.
So it looks like you rethought a few things in your personal life, but as you were going through the process of writing this book, you got a question from Kamna, who's an MBA student, about your biggest misconception about your earlier research.
Biggest misconception about my earlier research while I was writing Think Again. I think I had a few. I think one of the biggest ones was I thought it was a good thing to have strong opinions weakly held. So I wrote about this in Originals. It's a popular term in Silicon Valley, right? That you should express an opinion strongly, but hold it weakly. And it's a mantra for getting people to be a little bit more open to rethinking. And I had touched on it in Originals because it was something I saw Ray Dalio and his colleagues do repeatedly at Bridgewater when I was embedded there studying them in depth. And it was so interesting to watch how people would make passionate arguments and then afterwards say, no, actually, your argument is better. You're right. We're going to go that direction. And I thought it was a way to fight groupthink. And now I've completely rethought that. I think, the evidence on this, it's in chapter 5 if anybody wants it, but the evidence really opened my eyes to the fact that if you hold an opinion weakly and you express it strongly, people will think you hold it strongly and they find it harder to challenge you. And also when you argue for an opinion strongly, gosh, I didn't write about this, but I should have. I'm going to rethink this for the paperback. When you make a passionate argument for something you believe weakly, you actually convince yourself, right? And you're more likely to become extreme and entrenched on that belief. And so I think this is a dangerous idea. I think that if you hold an opinion weakly, and I think most of us should hold most of our opinions weakly, because otherwise we're not very good at changing our minds, then you should only articulate that weakly so that you stay open and you signal to other people that you're open.
Something else that came up in a lot of questions was if you've rethought anything since writing the book anything else that's in the book.
Yeah, I've definitely rethought some things that are in the book. I tried to do my rethinking in advance this time, knowing that the book tour always leads to a lot of rethinking. So I took an extra year to write the book. I brought a larger number of people into my challenge network to tear apart the ideas and the arguments and the data. And still there are things that I'm rethinking. So one of the ones that I guess this is, I don't know that I've rethought the whole argument, but I've rethought how generally it applies. One of the suggestions I gave, this is in chapter 10, is something I saw at NASA, which was a great example of confident humility. Just when a rocket scientist professes expertise, to make it a norm to ask, how do you know? And the hope is then that experts in the process of explaining their logic both get to educate other people and also sometimes recognize that they don't know what the heck they're talking about. And that allows all of us to learn. And I've seen some people apply this and say, well, how do you know? And it just elicits a lot of defensiveness. And so I think there's an art to communicating this question in such a way that opens people up as opposed to shutting them down, as one of many examples.
So rethinking is obviously a really challenging experience to go through, but we also got questions from multiple people about what you think your greatest challenge has been so far and how you overcame it.
My greatest challenge? I think it's hard to rank order them. This is such a maximizer question, right? Like, why does there have to be a greatest challenge? Can't there just be a set of challenges, all of which were challenging in different ways? I'm trying to satisfy a little bit more as a recovering maximizer. I think, I don't know, one of the biggest challenges I faced was when I went on the job market, when I was finishing grad school. And I remember going to a university that I thought I wanted a job at. It was my first interview. And I had to do this job talk where I presented my research and then faculty critiqued it. And I finished my presentation and it was very crickets, like uncomfortably crickets in a room of 8 people. And afterward, I found out I didn't get the job. And I was told that I couldn't teach was the reason I didn't get the job. The feedback was, you could not handle our MBAs. They will eat you alive. And I was crushed. I was like, oh no, like I'm not going to make it. I knew my anxiety was going to get me in trouble. I also know I'm about the age of a lot of the students I'm going to be teaching. Maybe I'm in the wrong place and I should stop trying to become a professor. And then something really interesting happened. They offered the job instead to a classmate of mine who was a horrible public speaker and probably the worst teacher I knew. And I thought, okay, you know what? I'm not good at this, but if they think he can do it, then maybe I can learn it. And I made it my mission to prove them wrong, to say, okay, one day I hope that they will come calling and offer me a job and I will turn it down. And a few years later, that happened. And I told them the story and I said, hey, you know what? Like, instead of judging whether people can teach MBAs on whether they lead an effective class in front of a bunch of curmudgeonly professors, why don't you actually watch them teach a class of MBAs or get their data from their students and see how that goes? And I think that was it was a pretty devastating experience for a while, but it ended up becoming a major source of motivation, which our own Samir Nur Muhammad helped me understand with his work on underdogs a few years later, when he said, oh, this was a group of people whose opinions mattered to you, but they're not that credible in that they don't know a lot about your ability and motivation to teach. And so that just fired you up to prove them wrong. I was like, yes, that is the story of my life.
All right, so for our last one, kind of linking to that, we also had a question from Lauren, an MBA student, about this feeling of scarcity, especially when we're like comparing ourselves to others, either at work or in just like social situations. So can you give us a quick like 1 minute wrap up of further inspiration about taking this thought pattern and turning it into something, a more positive reframe?
Tell me more. Scarcity, how?
Like, I think feeling like you're not enough is my read.
Yeah, okay. And so I guess that's doubling down on the imposter thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
I think the person who shifted my thinking on this after I read Basima's research was Sarah Blakely. I ended up a few years ago asking Sarah, how did you have the confidence to start Spanx? And she said, I didn't. Like, well, okay, well, how did you know that you could build like a $1 billion retail brand? I didn't. How did you go for it? And she said, well, I knew nothing about how to start a business, how to design a product. I didn't know anything about fashion or retail. But what I did know was that I was good at learning, because that's what I've done my whole life. And it just completely reframed how I think about confidence, to say that you don't have to be confident in your knowledge and skills today. You just have to be confident in your ability to learn and get better tomorrow. And Sarah's version of that was, all right, she literally sat down and read Patents for Dummies so that she could learn to write a patent for her footless pantyhose. And then she said, all right, I'm going to drive around to these mills and ask people to teach me how to design a product. And they did. And I think that confidence in yourself as a learner is what keeps you open to rethinking and also believing in your potential in moments when you might doubt yourself. So I would encourage everyone as much as possible to say, you know what, you don't have to be confident in your abilities today. You just have to be confident in your growth prospects tomorrow.
I totally agree.
Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I think that that's a great note to end on. On behalf of Authors at Wharton, we wanted to give a big thank you to Adam, to Mohammed, to our IT team who helped this all go so smoothly, and to all of you all for coming today. Please keep an eye out for announcements about our upcoming speakers. We have an amazing lineup, including Jonathan Haidt up next. We hope to see you guys again soon, and have a great night.